Okay. I think there's a couple people on already, but if you could type into the chat area how you're experiencing the sound and video quality, that'd be helpful. Can everybody hear me? Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing. Can everyone hear me okay? Testing 1, 2, 3. If you can hear me, and it sounds okay, and you can see me, if you look to your right of your screen, you should see a little chat feature. Please just type in there and let me know that you can hear okay. I've had some technical difficulties in the past, and I want to make sure that we've tackled them sufficiently. Okay. This sucks. I don't understand. Okay, I'm gonna try to restart this, and hopefully it'll work. Well, we're just going to get started. I apologize for any of the technical problems. I'm not sure why Webinar Jam isn't allowing people to view the webinar through the live screen. It's kind of shitty. I'm not sure why. You have to look at it through YouTube, and it's for better or for worse. That's what we're going to have to do. So I'm kind of bummed about it. Hopefully I'll be able to get it fixed by next time. I'm not sure what the issue is. So let's dig in. Basically, the way I'm going to engage this webinar is to look at some standard working definitions of what a prophet is, drawing specifically from the Hebrew scriptures, and then I'll move forward into the way that that tradition adapts and shifts within the Christian tradition. And throughout all that, I'll be abstracting in some ways some of the principles of how a prophet functions. And from there, we'll be looking at what does that mean for us in our context today. So this is going to be a little bit, the last podcast or webinar I did was very narrative heavy. This is going to be a little bit more analytical. So we can get some kind of working frameworks. And from there, we're going to go from working frameworks to trying to apply it specifically to our context. What does it mean for us to have a prophetic vocation in a broader sense as communities or as churches or as people, and then specifically as individuals who might have more of a prophetic vocation? What does that mean for us? I've been trying. I've been obsessed with studying this for a long time, and so hopefully I found the right sweet spot between not cramming too much in. We'll see. One of the classic texts about understanding the prophetic vocation, particularly within the Hebrew scriptures, is Walter Brueggemann's The Prophetic Imagination. He has some strengths and weaknesses as a scholar, but it's still fairly kind of this classic text. The other classic text being from Abraham Joshua Heschel, the prophets. I'll be drawing a little bit off of them predominantly, and then riffing off on my own as we continue. But basically, Brueggemann lists 4 kind of key traits of a prophet. And this, you can read about this all on your own. It's a great book, The Prophetic Imagination. But the first one is that prophets are a part of a tradition with a long and available memory. It's kind of a mistake to think of prophets as these individuals, kind of these rugged individuals out in the woods or the wilderness who God like possesses and then they just utter on behalf of God. There's a prophetic tradition within Scripture, and it's they have a long memory, and it's even in the Scriptures it talks about there being schools of prophets. But they have this, they're part of a sub-community of resistance that's maybe kind of more on the fringe or not as mainstream as the dominant spiritual tradition. And this rootedness in this sub-community with a long memory and a long tradition helps them not be defined by empire. They're defined by the relationship with a God who is yet unco-opted by the empire. Two, prophets are defined by their pain. Another thing that is, I think, often a mistake is that we think of prophets as maybe angry, that they're just angry at injustice and they're just spouting off. And this is, I think, the framing that people who don't like prophets put it in. Like, so if you look at even today, a movement that I think of as at least fairly akin to being prophetic, Black Lives Matter, folks are always just castigating them as being angry, angry thugs. But the defining emotional quality of a prophet is the experience of pain. More than anger, they're defined by lament. And this is important because empires, including our empire, lives by numbness. And only with the onset of deep grief does radical criticism become possible. So in other words, they're just not upset at things. They are upset, but it's more than that. They look around and see the pain and the destruction. Particularly in the Scriptures, you see them upset with the oppressors because of how the poor are treated. So that anger, even though anger might be a dominating emotion, it's rooted in pain. So again, this is from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Rather than seeing prophets as soothsayers or prognosticators, Heschel sees the Hebrew prophets experiencing what he calls theotropism, God turning to humanity, wherein the prophet receives the divine pathos of God's grief over the nation that has turned away. So the prophet is, in a way, maybe channeling isn't the best word, but they're definitely vibing on God's grief at betrayal. He writes, prophecy is the voice that God has lent to the silent agony, a voice to the plundered poor, to the profane riches of the world. It is a form of living, a crossing point of God and man. God is raging in the prophet's words. Three, prophets have an active hope rooted in the freedom of a God who opens up possibility. And this is hard. Again, protesters and different things today in our context are often seen as negative, but you wouldn't go and protest unless you had some sort of hope. Ultimately, prophets and any kind of resistant sort of energy that we see in our society that's organized is rooted in a hope that somehow things can change. Prophets' hopes are rooted in the idea that God can make things new, that there's always the possibility of repentance. Otherwise, the prophet wouldn't call for repentance. It's a negative kind of energy, but it's one that hopes in a positive outcome. And then 4, there is an effective mode of discourse. Prophets gather up that memory, which for them is often referring to promises God has made, events of the past. They gather that up with grief that they're feeling that angers them now in the moment, and this future hope to articulate an alternative way of experiencing the world that delegitimizes the mythic pretensions of empire. So in other words, They reach back to their memory. They are anchored now in their grief, and they look ahead to a hope that is resting in God to articulate the possibility of something else. And that articulation, that prophecy, it basically undercuts the other narratives that are going around and says, no, you need to attend to this, or you're going to miss out on what God is doing. Now, part of the reason we don't talk about prophets today, except for in an abstract secular sense, is because in the Christian tradition, prophets aren't as predominant as in the Hebrew scriptures. And there's some reasons for this, and I think it's part of the reason why we struggle to understand what does it mean to be prophetic today. So I want to talk a little bit about the shift that's happened in the early church. And I'm not, there's probably way more depth I can go into this. This just is a 10,000-foot view. One of the big reasons is there's a shift to Jesus as a fulfillment of the prophets. So even though we don't even like talking about Jesus as a prophet because we think it minimizes him too much, but the truth is that we see Jesus as a fulfillment of all those prophetic hopes. And our emphasis within the Christian tradition is to try to embody Jesus's way. And we might think about it more that way than think about it as being prophetic. Secondly, there appears to be a recognition of prophets in the New Testament, but overall, the prophetic function was embraced by the entirety of the church, much like the priestly function. This maybe betrays my not so hidden Anabaptist sensibilities, but the early church seems to be focusing less on these official roles within the church but more on how the community can embody these charisms together. And so you do see, it seems like it's probably more important, at least I'm reading between the lines, for the church to be prophetic than for there to be specific prophets, although you still see that. It's just the emphasis of these is to build up the church. There's definitely more of an emphasis on a diversity of gifts and how they come together as a whole in the early church. Number 3, according to the Didache and other early writings, prophets were akin to itinerant beggars whose simple living and dedication to the faith set them apart. And so John Dominic Crossan kind of picks up on this line, and I think it has a lot of credibility, that the prophets had a different function. They started acting more like we'd think of as sages who wander around, and they might help with the church to maybe help with the Eucharist or attend to specific functions, share teachings, and then move on their way. And there were even rules like how you were to receive them. If they would look like they were taking advantage of your hospitality too much, you just send them packing. At least that's what the Didache encourages. And so it's already, we're not seeing a prophet in the capital P sort of sense like Elijah. It's just much more down to earth. So you just have any old itinerant prophet can come, and the way you tested them was to see if they lived up to their teachings and if they weren't mooches. So it's a different kind of way of thinking about it. There's itinerant pastors and ministers. Eventually, the role of the prophet was absorbed into the developing notion of a saint. So in the dominant Western tradition, you have this whole list of saints who embody a lot of the prophetic function, but we talk more about saints. And we talk about the apostles, who are the foundation of the church. We don't think about prophets the same way because the idea is like, with saints, you're not always sure that someone's a saint until after the fact. And the focus more is them on living an exemplary life that calls us to the faith. And also prophets, there's an assumption that prophets speak a word against the institution to challenge it. And most of our institutions think they've already got it kind of figured out and do not really appreciate the role of the prophet very much. Which leads to the 5th point. The function of the prophet was subordinated to the priestly function. We have this emphasis more and more on, and we're going to talk about this in a second, of priests as being agents of continuity and prophets being those of discontinuity. The emphasis in the church is clearly more on keeping things going. We can see this now with the decline of the church and society. Seminaries are closing down. There's a loss of money. The emphasis is clearly on how do we keep this thing going, and they're not really open to being criticized. That's a long-standing tradition. I'm sure it's like that with every religious tradition, but the emphasis becomes on the priest who safeguards and gatekeeps and keeps them going, rather than having this chaotic agent, the prophet, who can come in and disrupt. So priests became institutionalized, but there is no institutionalization of the prophetic function. So this is maybe would not seem like a super helpful shift to make, but I find it interesting then to compare within other traditional religious systems. And there's often this shifting of the difference between the role of a priest and a shaman. And I'm careful about the using the word shaman. It's an appropriative term because shamans are specifically from, kind of a Siberia, that sort of region. And so to use the word shaman to refer to all medicine figures throughout the world is a bit of a stupid move. It's a bit Eurocentric to do that. But a lot of the anthropologists kind of play with that term. And so I'm going to use it, but I want to have that asterisk by it. A shaman we shouldn't look at it as a universal category. And we probably shouldn't look at priests as a universal category either. But there's a book, I'm just going to flip to my view here. One of the most helpful books I've read in a while, it's called Liberating Rites, Understanding the Transformative Power of Ritual. And this is by Tom F. Driver. I'm going to show that here for just a second. You might want to jot that down. In the book, he talks about a number of things, and one of them is that priests are agents, this whole idea of priests being agents of continuity and shamans or shaman-like figures being agents of discontinuity, just like we're seeing with the prophets. And so I think it's helpful to maybe just as a way of taking a second look, thinking of prophets in somewhat of that shamanic tradition, because priests, their job is, like if you think about the Hebrew scriptures, the priest they were temple officers, they received the tithes, they took the sacrifices, and they kept continuity. But then prophets would come in and disrupt. And that's similar to how shamans would come in. They have the regular function of a shaman can come in and disrupt. And it's seen in the way that they sought about ceremony and ritual. Driver kind of makes a distinction that is maybe a little bit too hard and fast, but I think it's helpful, that priests tend to do ceremony. So we think about things that keep us in continuity within the church, meeting every week. Within my tradition, it'd be more like you sing 4-part harmonies and listen to a sermon. Sometimes there's a Eucharist involved, depending on what tradition you're in, is a kind of a practice of continuity. But shamans do rituals if you need something to be transformed. So within our context, a ritual would be a wedding. A wedding transforms the state or the nature of the relationship. That isn't a practice of continuity. It isn't a ceremony. It's a ritual. It changes something. Baptism changes something. So if you think about that and from that framework, and then we look at the church, it's interesting to me one of the most transformative rituals that Jesus instituted, which was a prophetic transformative ritual, communion, Eucharist, has become our most central ceremonial continuity practice. So you see within that the doing of breaking of bread, something that should be challenging us and transforming us. I mean, the Apostle Paul said if you did it wrong, you could be basically inviting death to yourself, because really this whole communion practice was supposed to challenge and disrupt our economic senses so that the division between rich and poor would be challenged. But instead, we've taken its prophetic power out and used it as a ceremonial, priestly function of continuity. And that has implications for the church. I think the church and most institutional religions will take their more prophetic or shamanistic tendencies and reshuffle them under the priestly thing, because it keeps power and continuity and status quo. Obstacles to the prophetic vocation today. Um, Before I go on, I just want to recognize that I'm sure most of you are watching on, or you're all watching on YouTube. But if you want to bop back over to the Webinar Jam page, and if you have questions you want to type in before I move on, now would be a good time because I'm going to shift gears here. So I'll just give a minute to do that. And if you want to type in a question, I'll try to respond to it. Otherwise, there'll be time for questions and pushback and vehement argument at the end if you want. Okay, I'm going to keep going. You know, there's a number of obstacles, and I forgot to mention this one there. I think part of the problem that we're facing today is within any of our resistance movements and discourse is this pervasiveness of respectability culture. And this is just kind of an aside, so I'm going to switch screens. It gets hard talking about it. Like I've been doing kind of leftist Christian stuff for 15 years or so, and nothing. All of a sudden, when I started a nonprofit called with my colleague Zed, we started a nonprofit called the Center for Prophetic Imagination. Once we like somehow affixed the word prophet to what we're doing, all of a sudden it brought out all the angry people criticizing us for being false prophets. There's something powerful about the word prophet that we think of as a holy religious word, which is a problem. That's one of the big problems that we face is how often we think of people who do protest and resistance in general as arrogant, because it's kind of the same deal as the way white people who are in the status quo see upset people of color as being the racist ones. Anything that threatens the established order is going to meet some sort of resistance. But when we start adding spiritual categories and a powerful word like prophet to that, people get upset because they think you're being arrogant and claiming that God is on your side. Okay, and this is a problem. In that formula, we tend to instinctively think of God as always on the side of the status quo, and that it puts this onerous burden on people who do resistance to never claim that that God is on their side. And it legitimizes this whole way that our society works, that as long as it's respectable and it generally maintains the status quo, it's good. Otherwise, you're being uppity. So once you start talking about prophets, which breaks this societal taboo that we've had of bringing politics and religion into conversation together, and then forcing them to stay together, and then kind of using them as a tool to challenge the status quo, it just triggers people all over the place. I don't know if that was eloquent enough. That was kind of off the cuff. So this is kind of lends itself to some obstacles. So already, because of the temperament of our society, it's hard to get at this stuff. It's hard to be intentionally prophetic, which I think is something we need to do. For some reason, we think it's okay for people to intentionally be pastoral and even be trained for it, but we don't think it's okay for prophetic ministry. And again, that tends to privilege continuity. at the expense of transformation. So obstacles. Another one, number one, empire has become ever better at numbing us. Apathy is the defining characteristic of middle-class consciousness. This is painfully true. I mean, in some ways, our empire today is less obviously coercive, but it's better at numbing. And it's hard for us to even begin to start feeling the sort of grief required for a prophetic posture, because it's so easy just to check out. Our capacity for grieving well has been taken from us. Even with funerals, we don't even get to sit with the bodies anymore. Our ability to suffer, not that I want to line up, like make suffering a holy category, but our ability to suffer is important for us if we're going to do the work of solidarity. We have to suffer with others for us to have compassion. And if we're not able to suffer well, it'll limit our capacity for being prophetic. 2, our most powerful rituals of transformation have become ceremonial. I've already mentioned that. That's the case with Eucharist communion. In some ways, it's the case of baptism, depending on how you practice it. Instead of it being a radically political act, it's become like it's time for little Timmy to get baptized now. So because this is what it is to be a part of the church. 3, I've already touched on this. Our religious institutions equip people for priestly function, not the prophetic function. I mean, in my seminary experience, you learned how to preach, do some pastoral care, and read the Bible well. That's pretty much it. And I had so many friends that it's just like people that want to become civil rights lawyers who end up doing corporate law for a while first to pay off their loans. It creates this situation where pastors take on a disproportionate amount of debt for a job that doesn't pay as well as other kind of similarly, other professions that require a similar amount of school. And so it's already hard for pastors to speak out and say hard things, but all they're trained for is not to say hard things, not to challenge. And of course, politics doesn't, and there's no political classes in seminary. So we just don't know how to equip people for that prophetic work. 4, we've inherited a strong separation between spirituality and politics, and often lack the imagination to embody both realms the way prophets do. I mean, that pretty much speaks for itself, but it doesn't help that our predominant way that we see politics and religion working together is in kind of the shittiest of political expressions that we see. We've seen it now with Trump. We've seen it with other candidates who exploit religious language for their use of power. And because of that, we're skittish about really self-reflectively engaging in religious language and challenging the political arena. And we're a little skittish about talking about political realities in church. And so then that ends up stripping everything away. It makes it hard for the church to do justice because we fall into the lowest common denominator doing charity rather than pursuing justice. If you have other obstacles you want to add in just to the list, you can type them again at the Webinar Jam page that you had to log into earlier and just add it to the list. And if I see them, I'll read them out for others to hear. But for now, I will keep going. How to cultivate a prophetic posture. At this point, I'm assuming that those of you who are watching, especially those of you who watch later, this will be interesting to me because this video will be on YouTube and we'll find like I'm assuming, based upon the analytics I've seen for Google terms, that most of the people that are watching this you probably won't still be watching at this point, because you'll be the Pentecostal charismatic types who want to speak, to learn how to have a prophetic ministry in the sense of speaking bold prognostications, foretelling the future kind of stuff, the anointing, healing through the laying on of hands kind of stuff, which I don't want to knock those things necessarily, but most of that is bogus, because it's almost never in the service of the poor and the oppressed. But I'm hoping that a few of you who find this video, it's because you're recognizing that there's some things wrong in the world, and you've always wished and looked to the church or your spiritual tradition as having power to speak to these oppressions and injustices, but you've been disappointed by their impotency. And because of that disappointment, you felt the need to start speaking out more and more, and have found yourself feeling alienated and cut off and discouraged because people don't listen to you, and you don't know if what you're doing matters. You want to speak challenge to the church because you love it, or challenge to your communities. You love God, or your understanding of God, and you just want to see justice in the world and communities of love and alternative practice bursting up. But you don't see it happening, and you don't know what to do, and you think maybe it's part of your job in the world to help bring that about. You're the people, by the way, that I feel like I'm put on this earth to help. So even if this video only scratches the surface, and you feel like you need help figuring out how to do the prophetic work in the world, please find a way to contact me. It shouldn't be too hard. Just go to the Center for Prophetic Imagination's website and zap me a message, because I exist to help you. I don't get, and I know that it's hard work. So I have just some ideas, and I feel like I'm hoping in the next 20 years, as I become more of an elder, I'm like 41 now, I'm hoping that in the coming next 2 decades, I get more wisdom on this. I feel like right now I'm in the place where I'm just trying to figure out how to cultivate a prophetic posture. Because up until this point, all I've done really is recklessly throw myself into situations without being sustainable, and finding burnout over and over again. Trying to speak at churches and conferences, going to protests, speaking to pastors. We'd have done all kinds of things, and it rarely bears enough fruit to feel like it's obviously worth it. It's always an exercise in willful faith and hope. Number one, and this for me has been the hardest because I am a Germanic Minnesotan man. Number one, let yourself lament. Don't embrace apathy and denial. No one likes to feel pain. But part of the thing that causes our society to stay stuck and our churches to stay stuck is that we too easily push aside our pain. We don't allow ourselves to lament, and we allow ourselves to be numbed by our empire. And so if we're going to have a prophetic consciousness and a prophetic imagination, we need to get in touch with that pain. And it's hard because it's almost impossible to know what to do with it well, but we have to become accustomed to experiencing it. And at the same time, this is also hard if you're starting to feel that pain, is to cultivate hope rather than cynicism. For me, practically speaking, I feel like the more I focus on Trump and the stuff at the big level, the harder it is for me to have much hope, because I can't influence that very much. So it leads to this third one: put down roots in a place, love it, and don't accept imperial definitions. If I'm going to have hope, I have to find a place, basically a place for me to have hope. So for me, I live in the Phillips neighborhood of South Minneapolis. I just feel like I have to be neighborly enough to to have my hopes take incarnational form, like to really be lived out. And so, uh, even though I have cynicism about engaging in national politics, I try to get involved politically here. And to me, seeing every act as a political act, and allow the stories of this place to dominate my imagination rather than the imperial definitions. And what I mean by that is I can accept that I can believe that this is a small little piece of the United States of America, that Trump is the determinative reality of our politics today, that this is white land, that we're in a capitalist society and it's just the best we're going to get. Or I can decide, even if it's an act of willful self-delusion, I can say, no, this is still Dakota land, and there's still Dakota around, and there's reconciliation to be made there, and maybe I can be a small part of that. I have neighbors from around the world, and we can choose to be neighborly and love each other and create political solutions to problems that aren't determined by the laws that are on the books. We can be creative. I can build relationships across barriers. I can protest with the local Black Lives Matter group and challenge the system. I can do these small things and these small acts of hope and try to build up from there. Number 4, I tend to think the most authentic place that prophets come from is from the margins anyways. But if you're like me, a middle class-ish, at least by virtue of my education, white guy, and I want to start being a part of a spirit-infused challenge to empire, then it's completely illegitimate for me to do that apart from some sort of actual embodied solidarity in the margins. In other words, it can't be just academic. And this is one of the problems that I see, is that people think they can analysis their way to being prophetic, that if they've read enough and that they don't have any real experiences with people that are marginalized, that they can just critique things based on their analysis. That isn't the pathos of God that was talked about earlier. It's different. It's just qualitatively different if by your relationships with people, you experience pain because of their pain. And because of their longings for justice, you start acting and basically giving up some of your privileges or lending them to other people to amplify their voice. And you feel a strong emotional response that comes from those relationships, that you feel it is connecting with God's pain. When you're moving from that space, it's not the same as an academic critique. It just is not the same. And if you're going to be a prophetic or find a way to be anchored in this, you have to build good, loving relationships and experience pain and joy with people who are experiencing oppression. It's both energy draining sometimes and also a source of power and joy. Otherwise, if it's just analytical, you're going to get bitter and crushed. At least that's my perspective, and maybe I'm projecting my experiences onto others, but that's how I see it. Number 5, and I'm going to spend a lot more time talking about this in upcoming webinars, but number 5, develop contemplative practice. And this, I can't unpack what contemplative means. If you don't know what it means, I'll just barely brush over it. Develop a contemplative practice, but recognize that being prophetic is more than just being an activist who meditates a lot. This is one of the big mistakes I see, that people think the prophetic posture or a prophetic imagination or being someone who is rooted in the presence of God and challenges the system, that it's just like being an activist who meditates. Because oftentimes those two practices are seen as separate. Like activist is my political thing, but then I do some self-care, that's meditation. It's just that's not anchored deep enough. Contemplation at its deepest is the practice of sitting. Often it involves a lot of silence, where you're sitting and self-reflectively in the presence of God, And you're not asking God stuff. You're just sitting in the presence. And contemplative practice can start with simple things like breathing exercise or centering prayer, which you can Google that. Or it can be a form of meditating over scripture. But at its base, I feel like the important thing is to notice your thoughts and feelings so that you don't allow the dominating anxieties of our society, because our society wants us to simultaneously, our empire wants us to simultaneously be numbed and anxious, so that we have to be numbed even more. But if we sit and notice our anxiety and yield those to God or the Spirit, and allow ourselves to rest in that presence of God with this conviction, or at least a desire to know that God loves us, we can begin to see the world differently. That gives us, I think, the realism and the capacity to feeling the pain of others, and the capacity to feeling God's pain for us to enter into a prophetic task. Again, I'll say way more about that at a future time, but this isn't about making sure you pray and read your Bible. It's about not allowing your mind and body to be dominated by anxieties of the empire, but cultivating the conviction that God is present in all of the world and that you can see the world differently. This, I'm not sure how many are viewing over at YouTube. I'm just going to take the time because I know there's a lag also, probably a 10-second lag. So if you can, bop over to Webinar Jam, where you logged in, and ask your questions or offer your insights or pushback. I'll try to engage them. If for some reason you can't get back to that, you can. A lot of you that registered for this are my Facebook friends. So if you could just send me a message on Facebook, and I'll respond to it here on the video as well. Michael asked, thoughts on dealing with criticisms of prophetic work that slings terms like angry and negative, as you talked about? I don't know, man. I feel like people just often assume I'm angry all the time. Not part of it is also just social media. I think they just see me, my words seem angry, but they can't see my big, puffy, smiling face, because usually I'm smiling a lot. But I think part of it is a failure of their own imagination. And instead of like saying, no, I'm not angry, I try to focus on as much as I can, like, look, anger and negativity is an acceptable response to oppression. But ultimately, it's not. I'm not just deconstructing things, because people also say, like, I understand deconstructing, but sometimes you have to do things that are constructive. Or instead of criticizing things, why don't you do things the way you want to see them do? Or be the change you want to see in the world, or things like that. And my point is, like, look, we don't have the luxury of going and buying 10,000 acres of land and starting utopia. We have to deal with the reality that's in front of us. And people can't live whole and meaningful lives in community with enough for everybody and all the good things unless they create space for it. And that means pushing the system out of that space and creating new space. And that just feels negative. But it's not rooted in anything negative. It's rooted in love. Like, Black Lives Matter, again, is this great example. Like, they're called negative for saying, hey, stop killing us, because, which is actually ultimately a loving thing, because the goal is to like, hey, we should be able to live, and we should be able to live without having fear all the time, because we love ourselves and our community. And I know it seems negative, but the negativity was being done to our bodies. And now you're upset because we're pointing it out. So I think ultimately, if people are just going to be cheerleaders for empire, they're not going to see that. But I think if they're sympathetic, they'll be like, say, look, it's okay to be angry. Conflict's okay, but there's this other more beautiful thing underneath it. And that's what we're fighting for. That's kind of how I try to talk about it. It's hardly ever effective. I mean, people just think, if people just think our society is pretty great, it just has to be tweaked a little, they're not going to be convinced. What do you think? Let's give another minute or so for any other responses, and then I'm going to log out. This video will be up in perpetuity on YouTube. I'm going to try to deal with these technical difficulties. It's a bummer that I'm paying for this webinar jam system when it seems like I could be saving money and just doing it on Facebook. So I want to make sure the system works well and is useful, because I just want a good system. Part of the reason I use this is because I can share slides and stuff like that. So I'm really wanting to make this work and continue offering these for free as long as I can. So we'll see. Oh, Michael says, that sounds right to me. I've just had some recent experiences with this kind of critique, more than usual lately, and trying to reflect on it. I mean, personally, it's a little hard too, because again, if you're drawing from pain, you're usually going to, if you're experiencing pain because of the state of the world we're in, you're going to feel a little raw. And so I tend to take it to heart when someone says I'm being negative, because I'm thinking maybe I'm just acting out and maybe I'm being unreasonable. But most of the time I find that that's not true. I feel like it's good to trust our pain and not try to push it aside. And I think it's okay to lament, and I think our society just has a big problem with it, and so it just feels negative to them. But I think it's just very healthy and normal response to injustice and pain being inflicted upon us. Yeah, you said one of the things I've noticed is the truth about prophets not being welcome in their own place. Yeah, they're not really welcome that much other places either. But if they know you, or they can at least take you for granted, that it's harder. Yep. One of the other things that happens enough, like I've noticed, this is more from my conservative friends I grew up with and family, but there was this, they thought maybe I was just nuts. Like mental illness is often hurled at as which I hate when mental illness is used as a moral category. People want to like say you're bad, so they say you're mentally ill, you're crazy. And full disclosure, I mean, I deal with anxiety and depression, so it's not exactly that they're wrong, but people are really invested in the dominant categories, the dominant myths, the myth of the wounded soldier, the dead soldier as a holy thing. Like death in military, if you die in service, that somehow that makes your life sacred more than if you die some other way. Or, the myths of patriotism, the myth of meritocracy, that we earn our place in the society, the myths of private property, the myths of all these kinds of myths. And people really are invested in them. And so if you're really upset about those things that they take as super common sense, they'll just think you're crazy. And the closer you are to them, the more they know you, the bigger threat you are. So they just get really pissy about it. Any other questions or thoughts? I mean, I barely scratched the surface on this stuff. I mean, the Bible's thick, and there's a lot about prophetic stuff in there. And we have a whole history of human suffering and spiritual responses to it to draw from. So this is not light and easy work. So I'm going to log off now. If you have questions, something that comes up later, just again message me. You can just Google Mark Van Steenwyk. You can find my Facebook page. I have a website, markvans.info, markvans.info. And I'll try to get back to you. Thanks for tuning in. And I'll be sending out messages about upcoming webinars. If this system doesn't work well, I might try something else, but we'll talk later. Thank you, everyone.